Hello and welcome to the series Roots of the Reformation, a Medieval History, and this the first episode titled A Norman Papacy. I'm Mark Holinshed, and in this new series I'm setting out to find a path, or perhaps more accurately rediscover the path that led from the introduction of Roman Catholicism to the British Isles, and then follow the route that it took through to the Reformation and the consequent suppression of the Roman creed of Christianity in Britain. If you visited the Roots of the Reformation website pages, hopefully you will have noticed the links to its sister website, Henry VIII The Reign, and the sister documentary to this one, An Old Tale of Wives. The two sites are linked ultimately because this Roots series and the Henry series will join up. I've been looking at the reign of Henry VIII for some years now, and concluded some time ago that it's folly to consider the period, in fact it's a complete waste of time to consider the period, and in particular the break with Rome, without also properly considering the history of the preceding centuries, and indeed the preceding millennia. Frankly, the history of Henry VIII's reign is so distorted by the obsession with his 6 wives that it makes the history more difficult to understand, more difficult to unravel than a propeller wrapped in fishing line. To get to the root of the matter, it is necessary to go back in history for well over 1,000 years before Henry VIII even turned up. We probably know how the present day tale goes. The Reformation apparently was, supposedly, created to satisfy Henry VIII's demand that he should marry Anne Boleyn. The Pope wouldn't grant an annulment of the King's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Hence, the King of England shunned the Roman Catholic Church and it split from Rome. Papal, that is to say Roman jurisdiction, had first been established when St. Augustine arrived on his mission to introduce Roman Catholicism to the British Isles. Augustine did not, however, introduce Christianity to the islands, simply because for hundreds of years beforehand an older version of the creed had been practised, and the British version, the pre-Anglo-Saxon version, did not owe an allegiance to the Bishop of Rome. The Britons, by the Anglo-Saxons, had been largely pushed to the west, into now what we call Wales and the western counties of England. These Britons rejected the Roman version and thus began 1,000 years of antagonism that eventually flowed into the watershed of the Parliament Act of the legal year 1532. Now, every story, so the story goes, should have a beginning, a middle and an end, as indeed this one does. The introduction to this story really is the birth of Christ, and the actual tale begins with the arrival of St. Augustine in the year 597. The year 1066 is pretty well in the middle, and it ends with the Reformation Parliament of 1536. This episode, the first in the series, and a break with tradition, the story begins in the middle. We will start with that pivotal date in history, a date that almost everyone can identify, the Norman conquest of England in 1066. The rising power of the Normans and the papacy in the mid-11th century ran hand in hand, pontifical glove in Norman gauntlet. The period was seminal for the history of England and the papacy. Then once we've set these Norman foundations, we'll track backwards and forwards in time using 1066 as an anchor on which to tether, nice and securely, the full account of what happened. When William the Conqueror's invading army stormed the English coast, it was under the flag of the papacy, a flag which had been blessed by Pope Alexander II. In exercising his claim to the throne, William was also conquering in the name of the papacy and serving its purpose to reorganise the Church in England and bring the kingdom into line with Rome's revolutionary and far-reaching process of Reformation. The reforms had begun 20 years before and stuttered along until the Second Council of Melfi in 1559, when the Norman leaders in southern Italy swore an oath of fidelity to Pope Nicholas II. They also pledged military loyalty to future pontiffs and to uphold his reforming legislation designed to oust the secular interference from the control and administration of the Church. Prior to that, the period between 867 and 1049 was dubbed the nadir of the papacy, and periods of the 10th century referred to as the Dark Ages, along with other slurs such as a hetaerocacy, the government of mistresses, the rule of harlots, and even a pornocracy, the rule of prostitutes. The papal office had been under the control of the all-powerful Roman nobility, but this was a Mafia-esque version of the nobility, in particular the Tusculians and the Crescentians. Many popes who did not toe the Mafia noble line were murdered, mutilated, or both. With this Mafia-esque rule in Rome, the norm became a secular and not spiritual election of popes. The clash between the spiritual and temporal over the appointment of the clergy, as we shall see, became an ongoing conflict in Christendom for centuries to come. However, in 1046, this sorry state of affairs began at least to come to an end, with the introduction of some zealous reforms, and 20 years on, the papacy wanted to extend its absolute authority to England. A German, Henry III, had become the Holy Roman Emperor, or to put it more accurately, he was the Holy Roman Emperor-elect, because he had to be crowned by the Pope before assuming the imperial title. So, in autumn 1046, Henry III set out for Rome to organise his coronation. He probably had a good idea what to expect when he got there. The papacy was in a shambolic state. There were 3 popes. The upshot was that following a synod at Sutri on the 20th of December, Henry essentially fired all 3, and at the same time severely clipped the wings of the Tusculian and Crescentian families. It was probably not all legal, but it was done. 2 German popes followed in quick succession, but they died one after the other in 1048. But Henry III introduced Leo IX, another German, and as Bruno he had been Bishop of Toul, which is actually now in modern-day northeast France. It was his zest that got the 11th century Reformation well and truly underway. With the powerful support of the Holy Roman Emperor, the new Pope shunned the Mafia nobility, and he appointed his own people from all over Christendom. Among the most eminent of those was Hildebrand of Savannah in Tuscany, who later became Pope Gregory VII. He was probably the greatest churchman of the Middle Ages. He also appointed the outstanding Hugh, Abbot of Cluny, the Grand Master of monasticism. After years of corruption, it was from the monastery of Cluny, founded in 910 by Duke William of Aquitaine, that the newly invigorated Roman Catholics found the inspiration, ambition and confidence to grow into a universal, international, powerful and wealthy church. Cluny, like many other monasteries, was an aristocratic foundation. But Cluny at that time had one vitally important difference. Duke William decreed that the monks at Cluny shall be wholly free from our power and from that of our kindred, and from the jurisdiction of royal greatness. William placed his new monastery under the direct protection of the Holy See, and he dedicated it to Saints Peter and Paul. This unique relationship directly with the papacy ensured Cluny's freedom from external pressures. In 1054, the monastery was made exempt from all episcopal control except that of the Pope. Leo continued vigorously with his reorganisation, with strict codes of conduct aiming at stamping out years and years of corruption, hanging the dreaded penalty of excommunication over the head of anyone who would dare to break his new rules. However, for all his reforming work, in 1053 Leo made a mistake, or at least so far as he was concerned, it was a mistake. Because from about 1015 onwards, Norman knights had been recruited as mercenaries by both the Lombard and Byzantine inhabitants of southern Italy and Sicily to defend them from the Muslim attacks. Word soon found its way back to Normandy about the opportunities of wealth and fortune in the south of the peninsula, just waiting for adventurous Norsemen. During the following decades, many thousands left northern France to seek the bounty of Italy. The opportunities were particularly attractive to younger sons who had little prospect of inheritance in an ever more populous Duchy of Normandy. These ruthless fighting men became ever more powerful and more influential, and by 1030 they were demanding lands of their own. Two Norman families emerged as the most powerful, the de Hauteville from the Cotentin Peninsula and the Drengos from near Rouen. Tancred de Hauteville had had 12 sons by 2 wives, William, Drogo and Humphrey by his first wife, and Robert Guiscard by his second wife, and these 4 made their fortune in Italy. It was Ralph who initially headed up the others, the Drengos. Ralph died in 1045, and his nephew Richard arrived with 40 knights from Normandy and essentially took over the rule his uncle had enjoyed. He is probably better known today as Richard I, Prince of Capua. Richard went on to build an alliance with the de Hautevilles, and between them, by 1050, they had brought most of southern Italy, excluding Sicily because that was to come later, most of southern Italy under Norman control. Leo was worried, very worried, as were the Lombard inhabitants of Benevento, who asked for papal protection from the ever more powerful Normans in a request that Leo himself should become their overlord. Lacking any real assistance from the Holy Roman Emperor, Leo decided to take matters into his own hands and formed a coalition with the intention of sending the Normans back to whence they had come from. It was a mistake because in those days, unless you were stupid or overconfident that it was God's will, no one in their right mind went picking a fight with the Normans. The de Hautevilles, Drengos and their followers, however, were fully committed Christians and not looking for a confrontation with the Pope. They sued for peace. But Leo was having none of it and proclaimed a holy war. Even on the battlefield itself at Civitatate that June, Humphrey de Hauteville attempted in some desperation to negotiate a peace before a blow was struck, because he knew what would happen if the two armies clashed. "Holy Father," he said, "you really want to rethink this, because otherwise your lot are going to get themselves hammered," or words to that effect. But Leo wanted a showdown, and that's what Leo got, and his lot did get hammered. The papal army was annihilated, trounced. It was pretty well a rout. Leo was captured, and despite being held in hospitable conditions, he died the following April. So was it back to square one for the papacy? Well, for a few years it did seem that the bad old days would return. 12 months or so elapsed before the new pope was installed, and that was another German, Victor, but he died 2 years later, and the next one, Stephen, lasted well short of even a year before he died. In 1054, in the midst of all this, the church split in what has become known as the East-West Schism. The Eastern Church rejected the authority of Rome, and instead control of the Eastern Orthodox Church was directed from Constantinople. Tensions had festered for centuries, and matters came to a head when the leaders of the Eastern Church rebuffed a call from Rome to lend military support to defeat the Normans of southern Italy. In 1056, Henry III, the strong Holy Roman Emperor, the man who had facilitated the conception of the reforms 10 years earlier, well, he died. He was but 38 years old, and his heir was a 6-year-old boy. The Roman Mafia nobility now smelt blood. The papacy was weak again. Moreover, it was becoming weaker by the day. The Tusculians and the Crescentians made their move, and within a week of Pope Stephen's death, and on the 4th of April 1058, they appointed their own pope, Benedict X. In December, the Roman clergymen appointed their pope, Nicholas II. Now there were 2 popes. "Déjà vu," said Nicholas in Latin. "What shall we do?" Hildebrand had orchestrated papal strategy for years before he even became Pope Gregory VII, later in 1073. In February 1059, he had a solution and set off with a delegation to speak with Richard of Capua, and asked him for military aid to oust Benedict and his Roman orchestrators. The holy Christian Richard was eager to help and made 300 fighting men available to him. By mid-March, Hildebrand, Pope Nicholas and their Norman-backed army were besieging Galeria. Pope Nicholas was emboldened by this new Roman alliance, considerably so. In fact, so much so that he moved to exclude secular interference in the appointment of the pontiff. It was a move to lock the Roman nobility out of church administration forever. In April 1059, Pope Nicholas held a synod in Rome. He introduced a decree to regulate the election of all popes from that springtide onwards. And with just 1 or 2 later amendments, it's a procedure that stands good to this day. This was a brave decision indeed, and it must have been agreed with the Normans in advance, because it was an archer's salute to the nobility of Rome, to the empire, and anyone else who might now dare to think about interfering in the administration of the papacy. But there was more to come on this newfound papal alliance. The 3 older d'Hauteville brothers by now, by various means, had died, and Robert Guiscard, the eldest from Tancred's second marriage, now headed up the family. Robert had settled at Melfi in the Duchy of Apulia, and in June 1059 Pope Nicholas set out to pay him a visit. He left Rome with a holy entourage of cardinals, bishop and clergy, but this was no pretentious social visit. They were on their way, probably, almost certainly, unwittingly, to set the course of the history of the Roman Catholic Church, and indeed Christendom, for the next 500 years or more. Moreover, it also set the course of history for the British Isles for 1,000 years and maybe more. The great entourage arrived in Melfi towards the end of August, where great crowds had gathered to meet the pontiff. Greetings and welcome celebrations over, the two sides got down to business, which began with Nicholas's confirmation, that is to say papal blessing, to recognise Richard as the true Prince of Capua, and Robert as Duke of Apulia and Calabria. In turn, both Norman leaders made an oath to the Pope. Unfortunately, Richard's is lost. However, luckily, Robert's has survived in the Vatican archive. I think we can probably assume that they were pretty similar in content anyway. I won't read it out word for word, but in essence, Pope Nicholas is saying, "You have my blessing to conquer Sicily and drive out the Muslims." In exchange, Robert pledged his loyalty to Pope Nicholas and his successors, and if Nicholas were to predecease Robert, then Robert would make sure the new election regulations were upheld. So by the time Pope Nicholas set off back to Rome, the papacy and the most efficient, ruthless fighting force in Christendom, and probably beyond, the Normans, they had tied themselves almost indelibly to each other and henceforth operated under the same flag. The papacy, with its magnificence reinvigorated, could continue with the reforms begun by Leo, which it did in no uncertain terms. From here on in, the ambitious popes knew no bounds, and for their part the Normans were free to bring all of southern Italy, including Sicily, under their control. No one, be it the Empire, Byzantine or Muslim, ought to mess with this Norman papal pairing, unless, of course, they were prepared to take one in the eye for their troubles. However, just a few years later, as we all know, someone did mess with this Norman papal pairing, and he took one in the eye for his troubles. As we also know, the year was 1066, and his name was Harold Godwinson. But before that, in May 1061, William the Conqueror's kinsman launched an invasion force into Sicily. Indeed, his kinswoman, Judith de Evero, was at the very forefront of the military action. Judith was married to Robert Guiscard's protégé Roger I of Sicily. They became Count and Countess of Sicily. As we've just seen, the governance of southern Italy was now directed by a military-spiritual alliance of the Normans and the papacy. Now here in Sicily was formulated a design for the successful invasion of England by this soldiering spiritual union. Sicily was, still is, the largest island in the Mediterranean. England was, still is, part of a large island in the Atlantic. The Normans invaded both islands with a large cavalry contingent, which disembarked prepared and ready for immediate combat. There were probably in the region of 3,000 mounted horsemen, with the Conqueror's landing force in England. For a seaborne equine transport operation of that size, it was necessary to use purpose-built horse-carrying ships. but in the early 1060s no such expertise existed around the coasts of northern Christendom to build them. The Byzantine navy of the Mediterranean, however, had operated ships known as the Calandia for some decades, and the Normans were quick to replicate and develop these designs from eastern Christendom. So when William decided upon his invasion of England to build his own invasion fleet to include the Calandia, it was from southern Italy that he seconded the naval expertise that was lacking in the north. So we conclude this episode in the knowledge that the meeting in 1059 at Melfi with Pope Nicholas II, Richard of Capua and Robert Guiscard set the path that led to the invasion of England less than 7 years later. Without the agreement they reached there would have been no Norman Papal alliance, no family connection between the conqueror of England and the conquerors of southern Italy, no conquest of Sicily, no papal blessing for the invasion of England, and no purpose-built ships to carry the invasion out. But in 1059 there was an agreement, and in 1066 William did conquer England. However, William was the Duke of Normandy. He was Chief Norman. In the next episode, we look at the strength of William's management as Chief Norman over an ever-increasingly dominant papacy, his conquest of the Anglo-Saxons, and the containment of the pre-Roman version of Christianity in the west of the British Isles. So thank you indeed for watching, and I hope to see you next time on the beach at Pevensey Bay, where William landed in 1066. And you might want to think about bringing a tin hat and a visor.